What's up everybody and welcome to a new video. And in this video we're gonna go over my notes for the settings in VS Code. Namely, VS Code is highly customizable. Nearly every part of its user interface or functioning behavior can be modified. And you can do that with the settings editor. And you can open that in different ways. So for example here with this manage icon and then here settings. So here let's put them on the right side. And what this does is it lists all the available settings here and they are ordered by these categories. So you can use this tree view here for quick navigation. So then the next note is about the search bar here at the top. And with that you can filter those settings based on the entered search criteria. So for example, if you search for a minimap, then we get those settings here and in total there are 14. And if I search for font, then we get these settings here and in total there are 51. And then here on the right hand side you have these two search actions. So the first one is to simply clear the search results and the second one is to apply a filter to the search. So with that then the settings get filtered based on specific metadata about the settings rather than being filtered based on the text that you input here in the search field. So for example, one of those filters is the modified filter. So with that then you can see all the modified settings, i.e. all the settings that differ from the default value. Then another filter would be, for example, this feature filter. So with that you can filter the settings based on a specific feature within VS Code. So for example, to see all the settings related to the Explorer. And then lastly, our last example would be here this language filter. So with that you can filter the settings based on a different language. So let's, for example, filter based on Python. So these are then all the settings available for Python. And then if you make here any changes, those then only apply to Python. And here then also as a side note, the search bar here supports undo and redo. So for example, if I press Ctrl Z and Ctrl Shift Z, I can then scroll through the search history. So then the next note is about the structure of the individual settings. Namely, here at the top you have the setting ID, so this is kind of like a heading. Then after that you have a short description and then you have here a field to modify the value of that setting. And this can be either, for example, a drop-down list where you can select from a predefined list of options, or this can be such an input field where you can specify a specific value. So for example, if I set this then here to 15, what then happens is then this vertical blue bar here is depicted, which then indicates that this setting has been modified. And then lastly, here if you hover over the setting ID, then this gear icon appears, or if you click into the setting, then it actually stays visible. And with that then you can, for example, reset the setting. You can copy the setting ID, so this would then look like this. You can copy setting as JSON, so this would then look like this. And then the last copy option is to copy the setting as URL. And what you can do with that is then here if you go to a browser and input that URL, then this takes you to the actual setting within VS Code. And then here the last option is to apply the setting to all profiles. So again, profiles is one of those additional topics that I've mentioned in the first video that I'm not going to cover in more detail. So if you want to know more about that, then you can check out this link here. Okay, so this is how those settings are structured. So then the next note states that settings can be applied at different scopes. So for example, you can create user settings and they apply globally, i.e. they apply to all VS Code instances or workspaces. So for example, here I have prepared or opened another workspace. And now if I go here to the user settings and then set the font size to 24, then you can see that we get here this big font. And if I go back to the other workspace, here we also have this big font. Okay, so now let's reset that. So those are user settings. Then we have workspace settings. So those only apply to the respective workspace. So for example, if I go here to workspace settings and then set here the font size to 24, then you can see again that we get here this big font. However, if I go back to the other workspace, here we still have the smaller font. Okay, so again, let's reset that. And then here I also have a side note, namely, not all user settings are available as workspace settings. So for example, application-wide settings related to updates or security cannot be overridden by workspace settings. So to show that, for example, if we go here to the user settings, then you can see that we have here the security category. And if I go to workspace settings, then it's not listed anymore. Or for example, if you here search for update, then you can see here we have 21 settings in the user settings. However, if I go to the workspace settings, then there are only 16 settings. Okay, so those are the workspace settings. Next are then the workspace folder settings. So those only apply to the respective root folder within a multi-root workspace. And we've already talked about multi-root workspaces, so I will put the link to that video into the video description. But now to show that, here I have prepared a multi-root workspace. So we have here folder 1 and folder 2. And then here this file 1 is within folder 1 and this file 2 is within folder 2. And then here in the settings, you have this additional option to create those folder settings. So here for folder 1, for example, and then if I set the font size to 24, then you can see in file 1 we have this big font. However, if I go to file 2, we still have the smaller font. Okay, again, let's reset that. And then here I also have some side notes. The first one is that you can still set workspace settings. So therefore, let's go back to the multi-root workspace, and then here within the workspace settings, let's now here set the font size to 24. Then you can see we have this big font here in file 2 and also in file 1. Okay, so again, let's reset that. And then the next note states that, or the next side note states that to avoid setting collisions, only settings that affect the root folder or files within the root folder are applied, and not settings that affect the entire editor. So for example, let's go back here to the multi-root workspace. And now in those workspace settings, if I here search for zoom level, then you can see we have the setting. However, if I go to folder 1 here, then there are no settings found. And that's because the zoom level here affects the entire window and not just the files and folders within folder 1. Okay, so those are then the workspace folder settings. Next, we have then the remote settings. So those only apply to the respective remote. And here again, this is one of those additional topics that I mentioned in the first video that I'm not going to cover in more detail. So if you want to know more about that, then you can check out this link here. Okay, so those are the remote settings. And then lastly, we have language specific settings. So those then only apply to the respective language. So to create those, you can go here to this filter and then language. And let's search, for example, for Python. So this way, then you can create Python specific settings. And those settings can also be applied at the user level. So you can create Python specific user settings. You can also create Python specific workspace settings, and then also workspace folder settings or remote settings. So for example, let's create here Python specific user settings. And then if I set the font size here to 24, then you can see nothing changes here in this markdown file. However, if I go back to this other workspace where we have these Python files, then here we have again this big font. Okay, so again, let's reset that. And then here I have also a side note. Namely, some languages have language specific default settings. And to see those, you can go here to the command palette and then run this command here, open default settings. So this opens this file here. And now to search for Python, you can, for example, then Control F and then brackets and then Python. So those are here the Python specific default settings. Okay, so now we've covered all those scopes. So those are all the scopes for which you can apply different settings. So now let's go over these side notes here. The first one is about settings precedence. And here I have a link where I can see the precedence of those settings. And here, namely, later scopes override earlier scopes. So default settings have the lowest precedence. Then there are user settings, then remote settings, workspace settings, and then workspace folder settings. And basically then the same order repeats for language specific settings. So you have language specific default settings, user settings, remote settings, workspace settings, and workspace folder settings. And then the highest precedence have policy settings. Okay, so this is then the settings precedence. And then here the second note states that if a setting gets modified in a different scope, then there's an indication next to the setting ID. So for example, if I change here the font size for the Python specific user settings and then go back to those user settings here, then you can see that it here states next to the ID modified in the Python specific user settings. And then if I also change this, for example, here, and then go to the workspace settings, then here it says modified elsewhere. And if you hover over that, then you can see where it is modified. So in the user settings and in the Python specific user settings. And then here, if you click such an entry, then you get to the respective setting. So if I click to Python user setting, then I get to the Python specific user settings. Okay, so now let's again reset that. And with that, now we've covered here these side nodes. And with that, then we've covered all the nodes that I want to cover with respect to the different scopes. So then the last node is about the backup and sync settings button. So this is this button here. And with that, you can sync your data across devices. So for example, your settings, keyboard shortcuts, snippets, and so on. And alternatively, you can also access that via this accounts button here or via this manage button. So here's also an option to backup and sync settings. Okay, so now with that, we've covered all the points that I wanted to cover with respect to the settings editor. So now let's go over the side notes here. And here the first one states that the actual setting values are stored in the respective settings.json file. And here for each scope, there's our own settings.json file. Exception are then language specific settings. So now let's see how we can open those files. And there are different ways. You can use the editor toolbar of the settings editor. So for example, here we are currently at the user settings. So then here in the editor toolbar, if I click this open settings button, then we can open the respective settings.json file for the user settings. And if I go to the workspace settings, then I can open the settings.json file for the workspace settings. So that's the first option. Then the second option is to use the command palette and then here these respective commands. And then lastly, you could also manually open those files. So for example, the user settings are stored in these locations here. It's probably not so practical to open those. However, it's more practical to open here the workspace settings because they are stored in this .vs code folder in the root of the workspace. This gets created when workspace settings are modified. So if I open here the Explorer, you can see there's this .vs code folder because we previously made some changes to our workspace settings. So for now, let's simply delete this and then again make some change here. So let's here set the font size to 15. And then you can see that this .vs code folder gets created, which contains this settings.json file. And here the font size is set to 15. Okay, so again, let's reset that. So those are the workspace settings. And then here the workspace folder settings, they are located in the following places, namely the actual workspace folder settings. They are again stored in this .vs code folder in the respective root folder. And this again gets created when the respective workspace folder settings are modified. So to show that, let's go back to the multi-root workspace. So here for folder 1, there's already such a .vs code folder because we previously modified some settings for folder 1. So now let's modify some settings for folder 2 here. So let's simply set the font size to 15. And then again here this .vs code folder gets created. And here are then this is the settings.json file where the font size is set to 15. So let's again reset this. And now lastly, the workspace settings in a multi-root workspace, they are actually stored in this workspace file. So to show that, let's go back here to the multi-root workspace and then go back here to those workspace settings. And now let's set here the font size to 15. And now to look at the workspace file, I have prepared here or opened this folder. So here's this multi-root workspace file. And if I open this now, for example, with Notepad, then you can see there's here such a settings attribute where it now says editor font size 15. Okay, so these are the different ways of how you can open those different settings.json files. So then the next note states that settings can also be directly edited within the respective settings.json file. And those settings are written as JSON by specifying the setting ID and a value. And here full intelligence is available. So to show that, let's open here the settings.json file. for the workspace settings. And then here, if I press Control Space, then I get here a list with all the available settings. So now let's say we want to again change the font size, then we can search here for font. And then here pick the font size. And then here, let's set it to 24. Then you can see we get again this big font. So now let's set it back to 14. And here then, if you want to create language specific settings, then you would use this brackets notation here. So if I insert here brackets and then search for Python, then we get here this entry. And then if you add a setting within those braces here, then you can add or create Python specific settings. So for example, let's set the font size for Python to 24. And then if I open here a Python file, then you can see here we can have this big font. Okay, so this is how you can edit the settings directly within the settings.json file. So now let's go over the side notes here. And the first one states that if you hover left to a line number, then a button to edit the setting appears. And this, however, is only available for settings where there is a predefined list of options. So for example, here for this autosave setting, we have this predefined list of options. So now let's add this here to our settings.json file. So let's search for autosave. And then let's set this to off, for example. And then here, this button appears where you can also change the setting. So for example, let's set it to after delay. And then we can change that in this way. And for this font size here, this button doesn't appear. Okay, so that's the first side note. Then the second is that if a setting is explicitly set within the settings.json file, then it is listed as modified in the settings editor. So for example, this font size here is set to 14. So this is the default value. However, if I go here to the settings editor, this is then actually indicated as being modified. Okay, so that's the second side note. Then the third one is that to reset the setting to its default value, comment out the setting or delete the setting. So for example, if I again here set the font size to 24, then we get this big font. And now if I comment out this setting, then I set it back to its default value. Or I can also simply delete it. Then next side note is that some settings can only be edited within the settings.json file. For example, this workbench color customization setting. If we go here to the settings editor and then search for that, here you can see you can change it within the settings editor. You can only edit it in the settings.json file. And then the last side note is about this workbench settings editor setting. And what this does is it determines if the settings editor or the settings.json files are used as the default. So for example, if I search for the setting here, currently is set to UI. So therefore, if you click here, for example, the settings option, what this does is it opens then this settings editor. And if I set it to JSON, then what this does is it opens the respective settings.json file. Okay, so now we've covered here all the side notes. And with that, we've covered all the notes that I wanted to mention with respect to those settings.json files. So then here the next side note states that VS Code's features and their corresponding settings can be in one of the following states. They can be experimental, preview, or stable. So experimental features are exploratory features available for early adopters. So they might change or be removed in the future. And they have an experimental label in the settings. So to see them here in the settings editor, you can use this tag and then here experimental. So here is this flag. And those then are the experimental settings. Then the features can also be preview. So those are then features, those features have the final functionality, but might still be iterated on for stability and polishing. And they have a preview label in the settings editor. So to see those, you can use the tag preview. So here's then the flag. And then lastly, the features can be stable. So those features are stable and fully supported in VS Code. Okay, so this is the second side note here. And then the last side note is about settings and security. Namely, some settings allow you to specify an executable that VS Code will run to perform certain operations. And for enhanced security, such settings can only be defined in user settings and not in workspace settings. So these are some example settings. So if I pick this here, for example, and then here go to the user settings and search for that, Then we get this here, and if I go here to the workspace settings, then it's not found. Okay, so this is the last side node. And with that, now we've covered all the nodes that I wanted to cover with respect to the settings. So we've reached the end of this video. And then in the next video, we will go over the nodes for the UI customization. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.